This is the audio support for Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner, excerpts from A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and These Truths, A History of the United States by Joe Lepore. First, Give Me Liberty, excerpts by Eric Foner. The Panic of 1819. But instead of effectively regulating the currency and loans issued by local banks, the banks of the United States participated in a speculative fever that swept the country after the end of the War of 1812. The resumption of trade with Europe created a huge overseas market for American cotton and grain. Coupled with the rapid expansion of settlement into the West, this stimulated demand for loans to purchase land, which local banks and branches of the Bank of the United States were only too happy to meet by printing more money. The land boom was especially acute in the South, where the Cotton Kingdom was expanding. Early in 1819, as European demand for American farm products returned to normal levels, the economic bubble burst. The demand for land plummeted and speculators lost millions as the price of Western land fell. At this time, loans tended to be for short durations, and banks could demand repayment at any time. The Bank of the United States, followed by state banks, began asking for payments from those to whom it had loaned money. Farmers and businessmen who could not do so declared bankruptcy, and unemployment rose in eastern cities. The politics of the panic. The Panic of 1819 lasted little more than a year, but it severely disrupted the political harmony of the previous years. Those suffering from the economic downturn pressed the state and national governments for assistance. To the consternation of creditors, many states, especially in the West, responded by suspending the collection of debts. Kentucky went even further, establishing a state bank that flooded the state with paper money that creditors were required to accept in repayment of loans. This eased the burden on indebted farmers, but injured those who had loaned them the money. Overall, the panic deepened many Americans' traditional distrust of banks. It undermined the reputation of the Second Bank of the United States, which was widely blamed for causing the panic. Several states retaliated against the national bank by taxing its local branches. These tax laws, produced another of John Marshall's landmark Supreme Court decisions. In the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, reasserting his broad interpretation of governmental powers, Marshall declared the bank a legitimate exercise of congressional authority under the Constitution's clause that allowed Congress to pass, quote, necessary and proper, quote, laws. Marshall's interpretation of the Constitution directly contradicted the strict construction view that limited Congress's powers specifically granted in the Constitution. Marshall acknowledged that the Constitution nowhere mentions the right of lawmakers to issue corporate charters. But, he wrote, where the aim of the legislation, in this case to promote the general welfare, was legitimate, all means which are not prohibited are constitutional. Maryland, the Chief Justice concluded, could not tax the bank. Quote, the power to tax, Marshall remarked, involves the power to destroy, and the states lack the authority to destroy an agency created by the national government. Excerpt from A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The Other Civil War. Don't be confused, folks. This is not referring to the Civil War between the states that we'll talk about later, but more of a class warfare. A sheriff in the Hudson River Valley near Albany, New York, about to go into the hills in the fall of 1839 to collect back rents, and from tenants on the enormous Rensselaer estate, was handed a letter. The tenants have organized themselves into a body and resolved not to pay any more rent until they can be redressed of their grievances. The tenants now assume the right of doing to their landlord as he has for a long time done with them, vis-a-vis as they please. You need not think this to be children's play. If you come out in your official capacity, I would not pledge for your safe return. Signed, a tenant. When a deputy arrived in the farming area with its writs demanding the rent, farmers suddenly appeared, assembling by the blowing of tin horns. They seized his writs and they burned them. That December, a sheriff and a mounted posse of 500 rode into the farm country, but found themselves in the midst of shrieking tin horns, 1,800 farmers blocking their path, 600 more blocking their rear, all mounted, armed with pitchforks and clubs. The sheriff and his posse turned back, the rear guard parting to let them through. This was the start of the anti-renter movement in the Hudson Valley, described by Henry Crispin in Tin Horns and Calico. It was a protest against the patroonship system, which went back to the 1600s when the Dutch ruled New York, a system where, as Crispin describes it, a few families intricately intermarried controlled the destinies of 300,000 people and ruled in almost kingly splendor near 2 million acres of land. Those in this area, the local Western Mass people, you'll notice that you may have gone to Rensselaer near Albany. That's where this came from. The tenants paid taxes and rents. The largest manor was owned by the Rensselaer family, which ruled over about 80,000 tenants and had accumulated a fortune of $41 million. The landowner, as one sympathizer of the tenants put it, could swill his wine, loll on his cushions, fill his life with society, food, and culture, and ride his barouche and 5 saddle horses along the beautiful river valley and up to the backdrop of the mountain. By the summer of 1839, the tenants were holding their first mass meeting. The economic crisis of 1837 had filled the area with unemployed seeking land. On top of the layoffs accompanying the completion of the Erie Canal after the first wave of railroad building ended. That summer, the tenants resolved, "We will take up the ball of the revolution where our fathers stopped it and rolled it into the final consummation of freedom and independence of the masses." Certain men in the farm country became leaders and organizers. Smith Boughton, a country doctor on horseback. Agni Dever, a revolutionary Irishman. Dever had seen monopoly of land and industry bring misery to the slum dwellers of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow, and had agitated for change, and had been arrested for sedition and fled to America. He was invited to address a 4th of July rally of farmers in Rensselaerville, where he warned his listeners, "If you will permit unprincipled and ambitious men to monopolize the soil, they will become masters of the country in the certain order of cause and effect." Thousands of farmers in Rensselaer County were organized into anti-rent associations to prevent the landlords from evicting. They agreed on calico Indian costumes, symbol of the Boston Tea Party, and recalling original ownership of the soil. The tin horn represented an Indian call to arms. Soon 10,000 men were trained and ready. Organizing went on in county after county, in dozens of towns along the Hudson. Handbills appeared. "Attention! Anti-renters! Awake! Arouse! Strike till the last armed foe expires. Strike to your altars and your fires. Strike for the green graves of your sires. God and your happy homes." Sheriffs and deputy sheriffs trying to serve writs on farmers were surrounded by calico-clad riders who had been summoned by tin horns surrounding in the countryside. Then tarred and feathered. The New York Herald, once sympathetic, now deplored the insurrectionary spirit of the mountaineers. One of the most hated elements of the lease gave the landlord the right to the timber on all the farms. A man sent onto a tenant's land to gather wood for the landlord was killed. Tensions rose. A farm boy was killed mysteriously. No one knew by whom, but Dr. Boughton was jailed. The governor ordered artillerymen into action, and a company of cavalry came up from New York City. Petitions for an anti-rent bill, signed by 25,000 tenants, were put before the legislature in 1845. The bill was defeated. A kind of guerrilla war resumed in the country between the band of quote-unquote Indians and sheriffs' posses. Boughton was kept in jail 7 months, 4.5 months of that in heavy irons, before being released on bail. 4th of July meetings in 1845, attended by thousands of farmers, pledged continued resistance. When a deputy sheriff tried to sell the livestock of a farmer named Moses Earl, who owed $60 rent on 160 stony acres, there was a fight, and the deputy was killed. Similar attempts to sell livestock for rent payments were thwarted again and again. The governor sent 300 troops in, declaring a state of rebellion existed, and soon almost 100 anti-renters were in jail. Smith Boughton was brought to trial. He was charged with taking papers from a sheriff, but declared by the judge to have in fact committed high treason, rebellion against your government, and armed insurrection, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Those Indians, found to be armed and disguised at Moses Earl's farm, where the deputy had been killed, were declared by the judge to be guilty of murder, and the jury was so instructed. All were found guilty, and the judge sentenced 4 to life imprisonment and 2 to be hanged. 2 of the leaders were told to write letters urging the anti-renters to disband, as their only chance to escape heavy sentences. They wrote the letters. The power of the law thus crushed the anti-rent movement. It was intended to make clear that farmers could not win by fighting, that they must confine their efforts to voting, to acceptable methods of reform. In 1845, the anti-renters elected 14 members to the state legislature. Governor Silas Wright now commuted to life imprisonment the 2 death sentences and asked the legislature to give relief to the tenants, to end the feudal system in the Hudson Valley. Proposals to break up the huge estates on the death of the owners were defeated, but the legislature voted to make illegal the selling of tenant property for non-payment of rent. A constitutional convention that year outlawed new feudal leases. The governor, elected in 1846 with the anti-rent support, had promised to pardon the anti-renter prisoners, and he did. Throngs of farmers greeted them on their release. Court decisions in the 1850s began to limit the worst features of the manorial system, without changing the fundamentals of landlord-tenant relations. Sporadic farmer resistance to the collection of back rents continued into the 1860s. As late as 1869, bands of quote-unquote Indians were still assembling to thwart sheriffs acting for a rich valley landowner named Walter Church. In the early 1880s, a deputy sheriff trying to dispossess a farmer on behalf of Church was killed by shotgun fire. By this time, most leases had passed into the hands of the farmers. In the three of the main anti-rent counties, of 12,000 farmers, only 2,000 remained under lease. The farmers had fought, been crushed by the law, their struggle diverted into voting, and the system stabilized by enlarging the class of small landowners, leaving the basic structure of rich and poor intact. It was a common sequence in American history. Around the time of the anti-renter movement in New York, there was excitement in Rhode Island over Dorr's Rebellion. As Marvin Gentleman points out in the Dorr Rebellion, it was both a movement for electoral reform and an example of radical insurgency. It was prompted by the Rhode Island Charter's rule that only owners of land could vote. As more people left the farm for the city, as immigrants came in to work in the mills, the disenfranchised grew. Seth Luther, self-educated carpenter in Providence and spokesman for the working people, wrote in 1833 the Address on the Right of Free Suffrage, Voting Rights, denouncing the monopoly of political power by the mushroom landlords, sprigs of nobility, small potato aristocrats of Rhode Island. He urged non-cooperation with the government, refusing to pay taxes or to serve in the militia. Why, he asked, should 12,000 working people in Rhode Island without the vote submit to 5,000 who had land and could vote? Thomas Dorr, a lawyer from a well-to-do family, became a leader of the suffrage movement, voting movement. Working people formed the Rhode Island Suffrage Association, and in the spring of 1841, thousands paraded in Providence carrying banners and signs for electoral reform. Going outside the legal system, they organized their own People's Convention and drafted a new constitution without property qualifications for voting. In early 1842, they invited votes on the Constitution. 14,000 voted for it, including about 5,000 with property, therefore a majority even of those legally entitled to vote by the charter. In April, they held an unofficial election in which Dorr ran unopposed for governor, and 6,000 people voted for him. The governor of Rhode Island, in the meantime, got the promise of President John Tyler that in case of rebellion, federal troops would be sent. There was a clause in the U.S. Constitution to meet just that kind of situation, providing for federal intervention to quell local insurrections on request of the state government. Ignoring this, on May 3, 1842, the Dorr forces held an inauguration with a great parade of artisans, shopkeepers, mechanics, and militia marching through Providence. The newly elected People's Legislature was convened. Dorr led a fiasco of an attack on the state arsenal, his cannon misfiring. Dorr's arrest was ordered by the regular governor, and he went into hiding outside the state, trying to raise military support. Despite the protest of Dorr and a few others, the People's Constitution kept the word white in its clause designating voters. Angry Rhode Island blacks now joined the militia units of the Law and Order Coalition, which promised that a new constitutional convention would give them the right to vote. When Dorr returned to Rhode Island, he found several hundred of his followers, mostly working people, willing to fight for the People's Constitution, but there were thousands in regular militia on the side of the state. The rebellion disintegrated, and Dorr again fled Rhode Island. Martial law was declared. One rebel soldier captured was blindfolded and put before a firing squad, which fired with blank bullets. 100 other militia were taken prisoner. One of them described their being bound by ropes into platoons of 8, marched on foot 16 miles to Providence, threatened and pricked by the bayonet if we lagged from fatigue, the rope severely chafing our arms, the skin off mine. No water till we reached Greenville, no food until the next day, and, after being exhibited, were put into the state prison. A new constitution offered some reform. It still gave overrepresentation to the rural areas, limited the vote to property owners or those who paid a $1 poll tax, and would let naturalized citizens vote only if they had $135 in real estate. In the elections of early 1843, the Law and Order Group, opposed by former Dorrites, used intimidation of state militia, of employees by employers, of tenants by landlords to get out their vote. It lost in the industrial towns, but got the vote of the agrarian areas and won all major offices. Dorr returned to Rhode Island in the fall of 1843. He was arrested on the streets of Providence and tried for treason. The jury, instructed by the judge to ignore all political arguments and consider only whether Dorr had committed certain overt acts, which he never denied committing, found him guilty, whereupon the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor. He spent 20 months in jail, and then a newly elected Law and Order governor, anxious to end Dorr's martyrdom, pardoned him. Armed forces had failed. The ballot had failed. The court had taken the side of the conservatives. The Dorr movement now went to the U.S. Supreme Court via a trespass suit by Martin Luther against Law and Order militiamen, charging that the people's government was the legitimate government in Rhode Island in 1842. Daniel Webster argued against the Dorrites. If people could claim a constitutional right to overthrow an existing government, Webster said, there would be no more law and no more governments. There would be anarchy. In its decision, the Supreme Court established, Luther v. Borden, 1849, a long-lasting doctrine. It would not interfere in certain political questions, to be left to the executive and legislature. The decision reinforced the essentially conservative nature of the Supreme Court, that on critical issues, war and revolution, it would defer to the President and Congress. The stories of the anti-renter movement and Dorr's Rebellion are not usually found in textbooks on U.S. history. In these books, given to millions of young Americans, there is little on class struggle in the 19th century. The period before and after the Civil War is filled with politics, elections, slavery, and the race question. Even where specialized books on the Jacksonian period deal with labor and economic issues, they center on the presidency and thus perpetuate the traditional dependency on heroic leaders rather than people's struggles. Footnote, this is kind of true of Chapter 13 in the American Pageant. Andrew Jackson said he spoke for the humble members of society, the farmers, the mechanics, and laborers. He certainly did not speak for the Indians being pushed off their lands or slaves. But the tensions aroused by the developing factory system, the growing immigration, required that the government develop a mass base of support among whites. Jacksonian democracy did just that. We can stop here and move on to These Truths by Jill Lepore. Excerpts from These Truths, A History of the United States by Jill Lepore. The first 5 presidents of the United States, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, were diplomats, soldiers, philosophers, and statesmen, founders of the nation. Even Monroe, the youngest of the 5 men and the least distinguished among them, had fought in the Revolutionary War and served in the Continental Congress. But by 1824, that generation had passed. John Quincy Adams had been intended, at least by his father, as their successor, groomed from childhood for the presidency. You come into life with advantages which will disgrace you if your successes are mediocre, John Adams told him. And if you did not rise to the head of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness, slovenliness, and obstinacy. Loving father, huh? John Quincy Adams was hardly a shirker. He'd begun keeping a diary in 1779 when he was 12 and on a diplomatic mission to Europe with his father. After finishing his studies and passing the bar, he'd served as Washington's minister to the Netherlands and Portugal, as his father's minister to Prussia, and as Madison's minister to Russia. He spoke 14 languages. As Secretary of State, he drafted the Monroe Doctrine, establishing the principle that the United States would keep out of wars in Europe, but would consider any European colonial ventures in the Americas as acts of aggression. By the time he decided to seek the presidency, he'd also served as U.S. Senator and as a professor of logic at Brown and professor of rhetoric and oratory at Harvard. In 1824, it was said that American voters faced a choice between John Quincy Adams, who can write, and Andrew Jackson, who can fight. If the battle between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had determined whether aristocracy or republicanism would prevail, and with Jefferson, republicanism won, the battle between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams would determine whether republicanism or democracy would prevail, and with Jackson, democracy would eventually win. Jackson's rise to power marked the birth of American populism. The argument of populism is that the best government is that most closely directed by a popular majority. Populism is an argument about the people, but at heart it's an argument about numbers. A national hero after the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson had gone on to lead campaigns against the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, and the Choctaws, pursuing a mixed strategy of treaty-making and war-making, with far more of the latter than the former, as part of a plan to remove all Indians living in the southeastern United States to lands to the west. He was provincial and poorly educated. Later, when Harvard gave Jackson an honorary doctorate, John Quincy Adams refused to attend the ceremony, calling him a, quote, barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and could hardly spell his own name. He had a well-earned reputation for being ferocious, ill-humored, and murderous on the battlefield and off. When he ran for president, he had served less than a year in the Senate. Of his bid for the White House, Jefferson declared, "He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place." Jackson made a devilishly shrewd decision. He would make his lack of certain qualities, judiciousness, education, political experience, he'd make these lack of these into strengths. He would run as a hot-tempered military man who'd pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. To do this, he needed to tell the story of his life. Within weeks of his victory at the Battle of New Orleans, in preparation for a political career, he hired a biographer, 65-year-old David Ramsey, a South Carolina legislator and physician and gifted historian, whose books included a 2-volume history of the American Revolution and a heroic life of George Washington. But before Ramsey could begin his work on his biography, he was shot in the back on the streets of Charleston. Jackson hired his aide-de-camp, John Reed, who drafted 4 chapters before he too died of an unfortunate and unexpected death. The book must be finished, Jackson insisted. He turned next to a 26-year-old lawyer named John Eaton, who had served under Jackson during the Creek War and the War of 1812. Eaton was Jackson's bosom friend and adopted son, according to Margaret Bayard Smith, a novelist, and a remarkably astute observer of Washington society and politics. Her husband, Samuel Harrison Smith, was a president of the Bank of the United States. Eaton's Life of Andrew Jackson appeared in 1817. The next year, Eaton was elected to the Senate, and in 1823, when Jackson joined him in Washington, the 2 senators from Tennessee shared lodgings. Andrew Jackson, man of the people, was the first presidential candidate to campaign for office, the first to appear on campaign buttons, and nearly the first to publish a campaign biography. In 1824, when Jackson announced his bid for the presidency, Eaton, who ran Jackson's campaign, shrewdly revised his Life of Andrew Jackson, deleting or dismissing everything in Jackson's past that looked bad, and lavishing attention on anything that looked good, and turning it into strengths what earlier had been considered weaknesses. Eaton's Jackson wasn't uneducated, he was self-taught. He wasn't ill-bred, he was self-made. The election of 1824 also altered the very method of electing a president. Why should a party's nominee be selected by a caucus in Congress? The legislative caucus worked only so long as voters didn't mind that they virtually had no role in electing the president. Calls for the beheading of King Caucus had begun in 1822 when the New York American asked, why should not a general convention of Republican delegates from different states assemble at Washington a few months prior to the period for electing a president and decide, by a majority, the choice of an individual for that elevated office? 2 years later, popular opposition to the caucus had grown. After word got out to the press about a caucus meeting to be held in the House, only 6 of the 240 legislators were willing to appear before a disgruntled public, which flooded the gallery shouting, "Adjourn, adjourn," and so it did. With the caucus dead, John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay simply declared their candidacies. Jackson looked for a popular mandate. He was nominated by the Tennessee legislature. The momentum behind Jackson's candidacy grew, as well on the power of the newly enfranchised voters. When new states entered the Union, they held conventions to draft and ratify their own state constitutions. They almost always adopted more democratic arrangements than those that prevailed in the 13 original states. They abolished property requirements for voting, replaced judicial appointment with judicial elections, and provided for a popular election of delegates to the Electoral College. The new and more democratic state constitutions put pressure on older states to revise their own constitutions. By 1821, property qualifications for voting no longer existed in 21 out of 24 states. 3 years later, 18 out of 24 states held popular elections for delegates to the Electoral College. More and poorer white men came to the polls and were elected to office, much to the dismay of conservatives like Chancellor James Kent of New York, who, at New York's 1821 Constitutional Convention, complained, "The notion that every man that works a day on the road or serves an idle hour in the militia is entitled as of right to an equal participation in the whole power of government is most unreasonable and has no foundation in justice." He believed in proportionate representation proportionate to wealth. Society is an association for the protection of property as well as life, and the individual who contributes only 1 cent to the common stock ought not to have the same power and influence in directing the property concerns of the partnership as he who contributes thousands. As the kind of people who could vote changed, so did the method of voting. Early paper voting had been unwieldy and inconvenient. Voters were expected to bring to the polls a scrap of paper on which they could write the names of their chosen candidates. With the electorate expanding, this system became even more impractical. Party leaders began to print ballots, usually in partisan newspapers, usually in long strips, listing an entire slate as a party ticket. The ticket system consolidated the power of the parties and contributed to the expansion of the electorate. Party tickets meant that voters didn't need to know how to write or even how to read. Each party ticket was printed on a different colored paper, and each was stamped with the party's symbol. In 1824, Jackson won both the popular vote and a plurality, though not a majority, of the electoral vote. The election then was thrown to the House, which chose John Quincy Adams after Henry Clay threw his support behind him. Adams then appointed Clay as his Secretary of State. Jefferson wrote to John Adams to congratulate him on his son's election. Having retired from politics, the two men had renewed the friendship of their youth. "Every line from you exhilarates my spirits," Adams replied. Jackson, furious at what he deemed a corrupt bargain, resigned from the Senate in 1825, returned to the Hermitage where he lived, and bided his time while the electorate swelled. Between 1824 and 1828, it more than doubled, growing from 400,000 to 1.1 million. Men who had attended the Constitutional Convention in 1787 shook their gray-haired heads and warned that Americans had crowned a new monarch, King Numbers. On July 4th, 1826, the United States celebrated its Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Its cities and towns, Americans paraded and sang and raised glasses and listened to speeches. Many of those speeches celebrated the new spirit of democracy, the defeat of the contempt for the people who had been part of the nation's founding. There may be those who scoff at the suggestion that the decision of the whole is to be preferred to the judgment of the enlightened few, said the historian George Bancroft, speaking in Boston. They say in their hearts that the masses are ignorant, that the farmers know nothing of legislation, that mechanics should not quit their workshops to join in forming public opinion. But true political science does indeed venerate the masses. The voice of the people, Bancroft insisted, is the voice of God. Nothing more clearly marked the end of the founding era than the coincidence of the deaths of two men on the very day. Thomas Jefferson, the pen of the Declaration, and John Adams, the voice of independence. Adams, 90, died at his home in Massachusetts. He breathed his last about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, reported one newspaper, while millions of his fellow countrymen were engaged in festive rejoicings at the nation's jubilee, and in chanting praises to the immortal patriots whose valor and virtue accomplished their country's freedom and independence. He had been declining for years. He lost his teeth and his eyesight. He slept in an overstuffed armchair in his library. Lost my place here. And in a dressing coat and a cotton cap, surrounded by his books. He left them in his will to his son John Quincy. Cannons fired on the 4th were nearly drowned out by the sound of thunder, an afternoon storm. Having been carried to his bed, Adams stirred and whispered, "Thomas Jefferson survives." At 6:20 he died, but in Virginia, Jefferson, 83, had died at 10 minutes before 1. In a will that Jefferson had made months before, he had freed the last two of his children with Sally Hemings, Madison and Eston. He did not mention Sally. Invited to celebrate the 4th of July in Washington, Jefferson had instead sent a letter of regret and words upon the day, celebrating this self-evident truth. The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them. He was dying. Suffering and in pain, he'd been dosed with laudanum. He slept through most of July 2nd and July 3rd, and then refused the medicine. He died on the 4th, while the bells in nearby Charlottesville tolled the anniversary of America's independence. Sally Hemings' brother, John, built Jefferson's coffin. 6 months later, to pay his debts, Jefferson's entire estate, including 130 slaves, was sold at an auction. The Fawcett children, cousins of Sally Hemings, were among the 130 valuable Negroes sold to the highest bidder. Hemings, 53 years old, was appraised at $50, but she was not sold at auction. She had, by then, quietly left Monticello for Charlottesville, where she lived until her death. From Monticello, she brought with her a pair of Jefferson's eyeglasses to remember him by, a man of sight and of blindness. Their daughter Harriet Hemings was 27 and still living in Washington in 1828 when Andrew Jackson finally defeated John Quincy Adams in an election that marked the founding of the Democratic Party. Jackson's party, the party of the common man, the farmer, the artisan, the People's Party. Jackson won a whopping 56% of the popular vote. 4 times as many white men cast a ballot in 1824 as in 1828 as in 1824. They voted in throngs. They voted by casting ballots, not balls but slips of paper. Jackson tickets with which they cast their votes for Jackson delegates to the Electoral College and for an entire slate of Democratic Party candidates. The majority ruled. Watching the rise of American democracy, an aging political elite despaired and feared that the republic could not survive the rule of the people. Wrote John Randolph of Virginia, "The country is ruined past redemption." On a mild winter's day, March 4th, 1829, 20,000 Americans turned up in Washington for Andrew Jackson's unruly inauguration. Steamboats from Alexandria offered discounted passages across the Potomac. Thousands and thousands of people, without distinction of rank, collected in an immense mass around the Capitol, wrote Margaret Bayard Smith. Jackson was the first president to deliver his inaugural address to the American people. Following the practice established by Jefferson, he walked to the Capitol instead of riding. Harriet Hemings might have watched from a sidewalk. John Marshall administered the oath of office. Margaret Bayard Smith said that when Jackson began to speak, an almost breathless silence succeeded, and the multitude was still, listening to catch the sound of his voice. His voice rising, he celebrated the triumph of numbers. "The first principle of our system," Jackson said, "is that the majority is to govern." He then bowed to the people. Then all at once the people nearly crushed him with their affection. It was with difficulty he made his way through the Capitol and down the hill to the gateway that opens at the avenue. Smith reported. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story attended the swearing-in and then left, bemoaning the reign of King Mob. Even after the president mounted a horse, the people followed him. Countrymen, farmers, gentlemen, mounted and dismounted, boys, women and children, black and white, Smith wrote, carriages, wagons, and carts all pursuing him to the president's house. They followed Jackson from the steps of the Capitol all the way to the White House, where, for the first time, the doors were opened to the public. A rabble of mob of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping, wrote Smith. Ladies fainted. Men were seen with bloody noses, and such a scene of confusion took place as impossible to describe. Those who could not get in, those who got in could not get out by the door again, but had to scramble out of the windows. There was a real worry that the people might press the president to death before the day came to an end. But it was the people's day, she wrote, and the people's president and the people would rule. The rule of numbers had begun.